I recorded what I thought was a normal school day and ended up with proof I should not have. The detective slid the laptop across the table toward me, and I saw my own face frozen on the screen. Not from yesterday or last week. From 3 months ago, standing in the hallway outside Mr. Davison's classroom, my phone angled toward absolutely nothing important. "We need to talk about what else is in this video," Detective Raymond Kowalski said, tapping the spacebar. The audio jumped to life, my voice saying something forgettable about calculus homework, but he wasn't listening to me. He was listening to what was happening in the background. A door opening. Voices I hadn't registered at the time. And then a sound that made my stomach drop so hard I actually gripped the edge of the table. I'd carried that recording in my phone for 96 days, watched it maybe twice while editing my documentary project, and never once heard what the detective was hearing now. But now that he'd pointed it out, now that the volume was cranked up and isolated, I couldn't unhear it. The crack in someone's voice, the words that should never be said in a school. My documentary about senior year had just become evidence in a criminal investigation. I'd started recording everything on the first day of September. Not because I was paranoid or thought something was wrong, I was just tired of forgetting things. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patel, had suggested it during a meeting about my college applications. "You're stretched thin, David," she'd said, reviewing my schedule of AP classes, debate team, and the part-time job at the bookstore. "Maybe try voice memos for reminders, or keep a video journal. Something to help you process." So I did. Every morning, I'd record a quick check-in before first period. Nothing fancy, just my phone propped on my locker while I talked through my day, what was due, what I was worried about. Sometimes I'd film myself walking to class or capture random moments with my friends. My best friend Leo thought it was weird at first. "You planning to make a movie about how boring we are?" he'd asked, batting the camera away. But after a few weeks, everyone just got used to it. I was the guy with the phone out. David Chen, wait, scratch that. David Morrison, the guy documenting his unremarkable senior year at Lincoln Grove High School. That day in November started like any other. Cold morning, my breath fogging the air as I walked from the parking lot. I was running late because my little sister Becca had monopolized the bathroom for 20 minutes, and I'd grabbed breakfast from the gas station instead of eating at home. I hit record at 7:42 a.m., my usual time, and wedged my phone into the side pocket of my backpack with the camera lens pointed out. It was a habit by then. Let it run for 10 or 15 minutes, capture whatever, stop it when I got to first period. That morning, I was complaining about Mr. Davison's upcoming calculus exam while walking through the main hallway. I remember passing the trophy case, nodding at some freshman I vaguely recognized, stopping to pick up a pen someone had dropped. Standard stuff. I didn't remember stopping outside Davison's room, didn't remember the door being ajar, didn't register any conversation happening inside. But the camera caught it. Every word. The first time I actually watched that footage carefully was 9 days later, when I was compiling clips for what I was calling my senior year survival guide, a goofy video project I'd submit for my media arts class. I was scanning through hours of recordings, pulling 30-second moments that were funny or meaningful, and I landed on that hallway clip. I almost deleted it. Boring angle, nothing happening, just me walking and muttering. But then I heard something in the background that made me rewind. Voices, not mine, coming from inside the classroom. I turned up the volume on my laptop and listened again. A man's voice. Definitely Mr. Davison, our calculus teacher, the guy who wore the same blue tie every Friday and made terrible jokes about derivatives. And a girl's voice. Younger. Nervous. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone was wrong. Strained. The girl said something that sounded like please, and Davison's response was low, almost soothing, but in a way that made my skin crawl. Then the door clicked shut, and the audio went back to just me, oblivious, walking toward my locker. I told myself I'd misheard it, that it was just a student asking for an extension on an assignment, or maybe someone upset about a grade. Mr. Davison was a decent teacher. Strict, sure, but fair. He'd written me a recommendation letter for college. He ran the math club and stayed after school twice a week for tutoring. There was no reason to think anything was off. But the recording sat in my head like a pebble in my shoe. Small, ignorable, but constantly present. I didn't mention it to anyone. Not Leo, not my parents, not even Becca, who I usually told everything to. I just kept recording my days like normal, and every time I walked past Davison's classroom, I felt this weird prickle at the back of my neck, like I was waiting for something else to happen, some confirmation that I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, 2 weeks later, it happened again. Different day, different recording, same voices. This time, I caught actual words. "You promised this would stay between us." That was the girl. And Davison. "It will. You just need to trust me." My hands were shaking when I stopped the playback. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at my phone, replaying those clips over and over, trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was talking about a grade she didn't want her parents to know about. Maybe it was some kind of academic probation thing. But the tone of her voice, that wasn't about a grade. That was fear. Or worse, resignation. The next morning, I went to school with a plan. I was going to watch Davison, pay attention to who went into his classroom, when, and why. I started positioning myself near his room between periods, pretending to tie my shoe or check my phone. I logged every student I saw enter or exit. Most were just regular kids picking up assignments or asking questions. But there was one girl who showed up 3 times in 2 weeks, always right after the final bell, always looking around like she didn't want anyone to see her. Her name was Jenna Kozlov, Jr. Quiet, smart, on the volleyball team. I didn't know her well, but I'd seen her around. And every time she left Davison's room, she looked smaller somehow, like she was carrying something too heavy. I tried telling myself to let it go, to mind my own business. But then I recorded another clip, this one completely by accident. I'd left my phone recording in my backpack during lunch, just forgot to turn it off, and when I reviewed the footage later that night, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The audio was muffled because my phone was buried under my textbooks, but I could just barely make out my own voice talking to Leo about the basketball game that weekend. And underneath that, faint but unmistakable, was Davison's voice. He must have been standing near our table in the cafeteria. He was talking to someone, I couldn't tell who, and he said, "She's not going to say anything. I made sure of that." My stomach dropped. I rewound it 5 times to make sure I'd heard correctly. I made sure of that. Those 5 words turned my suspicion into certainty. Something was very, very wrong. I didn't know what to do with the information. I wasn't even sure what I had. A few ambiguous recordings, a gut feeling, and a teacher who suddenly felt like a stranger every time I sat in his classroom. I thought about going to the principal, but what would I say? I have some weird audio clips that might mean something. They'd dismiss me, or worse, they'd tip off Davison, and if he really was doing something to Jenna or anyone else, I'd just make it worse. I thought about confronting Jenna directly, but that felt like a violation. If something bad was happening to her, the last thing she needed was some random senior guy cornering her with accusations. So I did the only thing I could think of. I kept recording. Every day, every moment I could. I documented everything. Hallway conversations, classroom interactions, cafeteria encounters. I filled my phone's storage with hours of mundane footage, hoping I'd capture something definitive, something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. And 3 weeks later, I got it. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd stayed late for debate team practice, and by the time I left the building, it was almost 5 p.m. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars belonging to teachers and the custodial staff. I was walking toward my beat-up Subaru, phone recording out of habit, when I saw Davison's car still parked near the east entrance. His silver Nissan Altima, bumper sticker for some marathon he'd run. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except the driver's side door opened and Jenna got out. Not from the back seat, from the front. She was crying, not loud, heaving sobs, just silent tears streaming down her face. She wiped them away quickly, glanced around like she was checking for witnesses, and then walked toward the building's side entrance. Davison got out a moment later, locked the car, and followed her inside. The whole interaction lasted maybe 90 seconds, but my phone caught all of it. The timestamp, the license plate, Jenna's face, everything. That night, I didn't edit my footage. I didn't organize it or compile it into anything. I just backed up every single file to 3 different places: my laptop, an external hard drive, and a cloud storage account I created specifically for this. Then I sat at my desk and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. I couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. But I also couldn't just march into the principal's office and dump a bunch of recordings on his desk without understanding what I was actually accusing someone of. I needed help. Professional help. Someone who would know what to do with evidence like this, who could investigate properly without making things worse for Jenna or anyone else who might be involved. So the next morning, Saturday, I did something I'd never done before. I called the non-emergency police line and asked to speak to someone about a possible crime at my school. The dispatcher transferred me twice, and I ended up leaving a voicemail for a detective in the juvenile division. My voice was shaking so badly I had to record the message 3 times before I got it right. Detective Kowalski called me back on Monday. Deep voice, calm, professional. He asked me to explain what I had, and I gave him the abbreviated version. The recordings, the overheard conversations, the car incident. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How old are you, David?" I told him I was 17. He asked if my parents knew I was calling. I said no. Another pause. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I need you to bring those recordings to the station. Don't tell anyone at school what you're doing. Don't mention this to your friends. Don't post about it online. Don't talk to the teacher in question. Can you do that?" I said yes. He scheduled a meeting for Wednesday after school and gave me an address. Before he hung up, he said, "You did the right thing by calling. A lot of kids wouldn't." I didn't feel like I'd done the right thing. I felt like I'd just set something in motion that I couldn't stop. Wednesday arrived like a weight on my chest. I went through the motions at school, classes, lunch with Leo, debate team meeting, but my brain was somewhere else entirely. Every time I saw Davison, I felt this sick mix of anger and dread. He looked so normal, joking with students, writing equations on the board, sipping coffee from his world's okayest teacher mug. How could someone who seemed so harmless be hiding something so dark? Or was I wrong? Was I about to ruin an innocent man's life over some ambiguous recordings and paranoid assumptions? The doubt gnawed at me all day. But then, during 8th period, I saw Jenna in the hallway. She was standing outside the counseling office, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, and I knew I wasn't wrong. I drove to the police station immediately after school, my laptop bag heavy with evidence. The station was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. A uniformed officer at the front desk took my name and told me to wait. I sat in a plastic chair for 20 minutes, watching people come and go, attorneys in suits, parents with tired faces, a guy in handcuffs being led down a hallway. My leg wouldn't stop bouncing. Finally, a man in his mid-40s appeared from a side door. Tall, broad-shouldered, graying hair cut military short. He extended a hand. "David Morrison? I'm Detective Raymond Kowalski, Juvenile Crimes Division. Thanks for coming in." His grip was firm but not aggressive. He led me to a small conference room with a table, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. He saw me looking at it and said, "Standard procedure. Everything we discuss is recorded for documentation purposes. You okay with that?" I nodded. He gestured for me to sit, and I pulled out my laptop. For the next 90 minutes, I walked him through everything. Every recording, every timestamp, every suspicion. Kowalski took notes by hand in a battered notebook, occasionally stopping me to ask questions. "How long has this been going on? Do you know if anyone else has noticed anything unusual? Has Mr. Davison ever made you uncomfortable personally?" I answered as best I could, but the truth was, I didn't have many concrete answers. Just fragments, pieces of a puzzle I desperately wanted someone else to solve. Kowalski watched the footage from the parking lot 3 times, his expression unreadable. When it finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said. "This is enough for us to open an investigation." Relief flooded through me, but he held up a hand. "But I need you to understand something. This is going to take time. We'll need to interview witnesses, gather additional evidence, and we have to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If we move too fast or tip him off, he could destroy evidence or intimidate potential victims. Do you understand?" I said I did. He nodded. "Good. Now, I need to ask, do your parents know you're here?" I told him no. He frowned. "You're a minor. I'm going to need to bring them into this conversation at some point. But for now, let's keep this between us. I don't want word getting back to anyone at the school until we have a clearer picture of what's going on." He took my contact information, copied all the files from my laptop onto a secure drive, and gave me a card with his direct number. "If you see or hear anything else, you call me immediately, day or night. And David?" He looked me straight in the eye. "Don't try to investigate this on your own. I know you want to help, but you've already done the hardest part. Let us take it from here." I promised I would. But even as I walked out of the station, I knew keeping that promise was going to be nearly impossible. Because the next day at school, Davison called me into his classroom after hours, and the look on his face told me he knew something was wrong. I almost didn't go. When I saw the note taped to my locker, "David, please stop by my room after school to discuss your recommendation letter. Mr. D." My first instinct was to ignore it and head straight home, but if I did that, it would look suspicious, and Kowalski had told me to act normal. So at 3:30 p.m., I walked into Davison's classroom with my heart hammering and my phone recording in my pocket. He was sitting at his desk, grading papers, and he looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "David, thanks for stopping by. Close the door, would you?" I hesitated, then left it open a crack. He noticed, but didn't comment. "I wanted to check in about your college applications. How's everything going?" His tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp, searching. I told him everything was fine, that I'd submitted most of my apps already. He nodded slowly. "That's great. You've always been one of my best students, responsible, observant." The way he emphasized observant made my skin crawl. "I also wanted to ask if everything's okay. You've seemed distracted lately. Is something going on?" I lied. Told him I was just stressed about exams and applications. He watched me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You know, David, high school can be a complicated place. A lot of things happen that people misunderstand. Rumors start. People jump to conclusions." My throat went dry. He knew. He didn't know exactly what I had, but he knew something was up. "If you ever hear anything at all, that concerns you, I hope you'd feel comfortable coming to me first, before, say, talking to anyone else about it." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. I forced myself to meet his eyes and said, "Of course, Mr. Davison, but I haven't heard anything." He smiled. "Good. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings, especially ones that could hurt people unnecessarily." I left his classroom with my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could drive, and the first thing I did when I got home was call Kowalski. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened, every word, every look, every implication. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then, "He's trying to figure out what you know. That's actually a good sign. It means he's worried. But it also means we need to move faster than I'd hoped." I'm going to need you to avoid being alone with him from now on. If he contacts you again, tell me immediately. And David? His voice softened slightly. You're doing fine. I know this is scary, but you're handling it exactly right. I wanted to believe him, but that night I barely slept. Every noise in the house made me jump. I kept replaying Davison's words in my head, the way he'd looked at me like he was trying to read my thoughts. The next morning, I went to school exhausted and paranoid, and that's when things started to unravel even faster. Because Jenna wasn't there. Her locker was closed, her seat in third period empty. And when I asked someone from the volleyball team where she was, they said she hadn't been to practice in 3 days. I called Kowalski during lunch from my car. She's missing, I said, my voice cracking. Jenna Kozlov. She hasn't been to school in days. He told me to stay calm, that there could be a dozen innocent explanations, but I could hear the tension in his voice. I'll look into it. In the meantime, you need to stay focused on acting normal. Can you do that? I said yes, but I was lying. I couldn't act normal. Not when I knew something was happening, and I was the only one with proof. That afternoon, I made a decision. I was going to find out where Jenna was. I started with social media. Her Instagram was private, but her Snapchat location was still active. She was at home. I didn't know her address, but I knew someone who might. Her teammate, a girl named Bethany, who I'd worked with on a group project freshman year. I found her after school and asked as casually as I could if she knew how Jenna was doing. Bethany looked at me like I'd just asked her to solve a calculus equation. Why do you care? I scrambled for an excuse. She seemed upset last time I saw her. Just wanted to make sure she's okay. Bethany studied me for a moment, then sighed. She's dealing with some stuff. Family stuff. That's all I know. Family stuff. The phrase stuck with me. What if I was wrong? What if Jenna's absences had nothing to do with Davison and everything to do with something else entirely? But then I remembered the parking lot footage. The tears. The way she'd looked around like she was afraid of being seen. That wasn't family stuff. That was fear. I spent that night combing through every piece of footage I had, looking for anything I might have missed. And I found something. A clip from 3 weeks ago, before I'd started paying close attention. It was a recording from the library. I'd been studying with Leo, and my phone had been sitting on the table, camera angled toward the stacks. In the background, barely visible, was Jenna. She was sitting at a computer, and Davison was standing behind her, leaning over her shoulder. It looked innocent, a teacher helping a student, but his hand was on the back of her chair. And the way she was sitting, shoulders hunched, head down, it didn't look like help. It looked like she was trapped. I sent the clip to Kowalski that night with a message. Found something else. He called me the next morning before school. We're moving forward with the investigation. I've brought in another detective, Julia Brennan, who specializes in these cases. We're going to need to interview Jenna directly, but we're waiting for the right moment. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me. He paused. I need you to keep recording. Anything and everything you can. I know I told you not to investigate, but at this point, you're our best set of eyes in that building. Just be smart about it. I agreed, but I felt sick. I was 17 years old, and I was being asked to gather evidence in what was clearly becoming a criminal case. That day at school, I felt like everyone was watching me. Davison didn't call me into his classroom again, but I saw him watching me in the hallway, his expression unreadable. I kept my phone recording constantly, capturing every interaction, every moment. And then, on Friday, everything exploded. The principal called an emergency assembly during 5th period. We all filed into the auditorium, confused and buzzing with speculation. Principal Greaves stood at the podium, looking grim. I need to inform you that Mr. Davison will not be returning to school. He has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. That's all I can say at this time. The auditorium erupted. People shouting questions, whispering theories. I sat frozen in my seat, my heart pounding. It was happening. It was really happening. That afternoon, Kowalski called and asked me to come back to the station. This time, he wanted me to bring my parents. I told my mom and dad that night over dinner, the whole story spilling out in a disjointed mess. They were shocked, horrified, and then angry. Not at me, but at the situation. Why didn't you tell us sooner? My mom asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have a good answer. The next day, Saturday, we all went to the station together. Kowalski was there with Detective Brennan, a woman in her early 50s with short auburn hair and sharp green eyes. She introduced herself as someone who'd worked on over 100 cases involving minors and educators. Your son did something incredibly difficult, she told my parents. Most kids wouldn't have had the courage to come forward. She turned to me. We've interviewed Jenna Kozlov. She's confirmed that Mr. Davison engaged in inappropriate conduct with her over a period of 6 months. Your recordings corroborate her account and provide us with additional evidence we wouldn't have had otherwise. My stomach dropped. 6 months. Is she okay? I asked. Brennan's expression softened. She will be. She's receiving support, and her family is involved now. But this is going to be a long process. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded. It turned out Jenna wasn't the only victim. 2 other students, both juniors, both girls, came forward after hearing about Davison's leave. Their stories were similar. Inappropriate comments that escalated into messages, meetings after school, manipulative behavior that made them feel trapped and ashamed. My recordings helped establish a pattern. They showed Davison isolating students, showed the timing of his interactions, showed the way he'd cultivated trust, and then exploited it. The school board launched their own investigation. Parents demanded answers. Local news picked up the story, though they kept the victims' names confidential and referred to Davison only as a Lincoln Grove educator under investigation. The whole thing felt surreal. I'd go to school and see reporters camped outside the gates, microphones and cameras ready. My classmates treated me like I was invisible one moment and a celebrity the next. Some people thanked me. Others accused me of ruining a man's life over nothing. Leo stuck by me, but even he didn't know what to say half the time. "You did the right thing," he'd tell me, and I wanted to believe him. The hardest part was testifying. 6 weeks after I'd first gone to the police, I was called to give a formal deposition. It took place in a conference room at the district attorney's office. There was a stenographer, 2 attorneys, Kowalski, Brennan, and a victim advocate I'd never met. They walked me through everything again, step by step. Every recording, every observation, every detail. The defense attorney, Davison had hired a lawyer by then, tried to poke holes in my testimony. "Isn't it true you were failing Mr. Davison's class?" "No, I had a B+. "Isn't it possible you misinterpreted innocent interactions?" "No, not when you listened to the audio clearly." "You recorded people without their consent. Isn't that illegal?" Kowalski stepped in before I could answer. "The recordings were made in public spaces within the school. They're admissible." The deposition lasted 4 hours. When it was over, I felt like I'd been wrung out. My mom hugged me in the parking lot, and I realized I was shaking. "You were so brave," she whispered. But I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd just relived the worst 3 months of my life in excruciating detail. The case went to trial in the spring. Davison was charged with 3 counts of improper conduct with a minor and 1 count of abuse of authority. I wasn't required to testify in court. My deposition and the recordings were enough, but I went to the trial anyway. I needed to see it through. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and cold. Davison sat at the defense table in a suit, looking nothing like the teacher I'd known. He looked smaller, diminished. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. The recordings, the witness statements, the timeline of events. Jenna testified, brave and steady, even when the defense attorney tried to discredit her. The other victims testified. And when my recordings were played for the jury, the audio of Davison's voice, the video from the parking lot, I watched the jurors' faces. Some looked horrified, others looked angry. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, the courtroom was silent. Then someone, one of the victims' mothers, let out a sob, and it broke the dam. People were crying, hugging, whispering. Davison's face went white. He stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence. 8 years in prison, lifetime registration as a sex offender, permanent revocation of his teaching license. It was over. I didn't feel relief. Not right away. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, like I'd been running on adrenaline for months and had finally hit a wall. That night, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Not because I was sad, exactly, but because it was finally done. Because Jenna and the others would get to move forward without Davison's shadow hanging over them. Because I'd done what I'd set out to do, even when it was terrifying. When I got home, my parents were waiting. They didn't ask me how I was feeling. They just pulled me into a hug, and we stood there in the kitchen for a long time. My little sister Becca came downstairs and joined us, even though she didn't fully understand what had happened. "You're a good person," she said quietly. And for the first time in months, I let myself believe it. The rest of senior year was strange. I finished my classes, walked at graduation, got accepted to a decent college. People still whispered about me in the hallways, some with admiration, some with suspicion, but I stopped caring what they thought. Jenna reached out to me once, a few weeks after the trial. She sent me a message on Instagram. "Thank you for seeing what no one else did. You gave me my life back." I didn't know how to respond, so I just wrote, "I'm glad you're okay." It felt inadequate, but she hearted the message, and I figured that was enough. Leo and I stayed friends, and he never asked me about the recordings unless I brought them up first. "You did what you had to do," he said once. "That's all anyone can ask." I stopped recording everything after that. Deleted the app, cleared out my cloud storage, put my phone away during the day. I'd spent months documenting my life, trying to capture something meaningful, and in the end, I'd captured something I wished I'd never seen. But I couldn't regret it. Not when it had mattered so much. A year later, I was sitting in my dorm room at college, unpacking boxes and setting up my desk, when I got an email from Detective Kowalski. It was short, just a few lines. "Wanted to let you know that 2 more victims have come forward since the trial. Davison's sentence was extended. Your recordings made it possible for them to feel safe enough to speak up. You should be proud." I read it 3 times, then closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet. Proud wasn't the word I'd use. Relieved, maybe. Grateful that something good had come from something so ugly. I thought about that morning in November when I'd recorded a normal school day and accidentally captured proof of something terrible. How a single decision to speak up had set off a chain reaction I never could have predicted. And I thought about all the kids who'd been hurt, who were finally getting justice, who could move forward now because someone had listened. I couldn't change what had happened, but I'd helped make sure it wouldn't happen again. That had to count for something. The recording was still out there, locked in an evidence locker somewhere, a permanent record of the day everything changed. I didn't need it anymore. I knew what it meant, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.